We're so glad you could join us for this important and timely webinar on how the One Big Beautiful Bill Act impacts your tax discount for your on-site solar projects. I'm Tom Griffith, Director of Origination with NorthStar Clean Energy, and I'll be one of your speakers today. To cover a few housekeeping items before we begin, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording afterward for anyone who would like to revisit the content. All attendees are going to remain muted throughout the session to help minimize background noise. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them via the chat. We're monitoring it closely and we'll address your questions during the Q&A segment at the end of today's webinar. As clean energy leaders, we know how critical it is for the policy changes that impact both our sustainability goals and our bottom line. That's why we're thrilled to have Elizabeth Crouse, tax attorney at Holland Knight, here with us today. Elizabeth will help walk us through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, outline the steps you need to know to ensure projects remain eligible for the 30% tax discount, and highlight key project details and deadlines. She'll also cover foreign entities of concern before transitioning into discussion on the phase out of energy incentives and what you need to know to stay compliant. Following Elizabeth's update, I'll share how some of our solutions are currently benefiting our customers and how they may benefit you. At this time, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Crouse. Elizabeth brings deep expertise in the energy tax law and has been guiding businesses through the evolving landscape of clean energy incentives. Elizabeth, over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. And glad to be with you all today. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I'm sure many of you have heard of it by now. It was enacted on the 4th of July. Congress passed it just a day or so before then. Essentially what it does is a lot of different things, frankly. It's a pretty big bill. It has reduced some corporate taxes. It's doing a lot of other things as well. But one of the things that we care about the most in this particular industry is that they essentially stopped tax credits for solar and wind projects. Obviously, the deadline's not today. It wasn't July 4th either. But generally speaking, what the bill did is it essentially means that you've got to do something more or less now in order to still get the ITC on solar projects or the PTC. Really quickly, for those of you who aren't really focused on this area, the ITC is the investment tax credit. It's the big lump sum tax credit that most people use on solar. The PTC is the production tax credit. It can be used for solar, but often is not, particularly for smaller solar projects. They work a little bit differently, but a lot of the same rules will apply that we're going to talk about today. At a high level, there is a really, really strict deadline for July 3rd of 26. If action is not taken by then the credits are more or less gone. Not completely gone, but you'll have a really hard time getting them, let me put it that way. One of the things that's animating a lot of these deadlines is these new rules on foreign entities of concern. The OBBBA had several different provisions in it that had to do with sort of provisions that don't want to benefit certain countries, in particular China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. We see those pop up in the tax credit provisions as well. We'll talk about them a little bit, mostly in terms of just deadlines and painfulness, shall we say. These rules are extremely complicated, and I don't want to confuse anyone. So, okay. So let's talk about timing and timelines a little bit. Here, what we have in terms of the FEOC outcomes, the foreign entity of concern outcomes, as well as just general issues here. That's really what's in play. And so there's a lot of lines on this slide, but there's not a whole lot of time to deal with here. So if you look at the top line, this dark green, that is sort of like the golden spot, if you will, right? If you started construction on a project, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a second, but if you started construction on a project back in 24 or earlier, you could qualify for the old ITC, or code section 48, which is the easiest one, as long as you finish up the project and start operating it by the end of 2028. So that's 4 years, right? It gives you quite a bit of time. The nice thing about those projects is that they're pretty easy to qualify for. We don't have to worry about those foreign entity of concern rules. And we also don't have some of the other deadlines that apply to the new version of the ITC, which became available on January 1. And so now, obviously, sitting here on September 23rd, it's nice to say shoulda, woulda, coulda. But in 2025, we still have some options, okay? The tax credit that is at issue now is still an investment tax credit. It's still an ITC. It's a little different, but generally speaking, it works pretty seamlessly for solar. In order to qualify for that one without having horrible rules applied to you, what you generally speaking want to do is either begin construction by earlier this month, again, shoulda, woulda, coulda, or you want to definitely begin construction by the end of this year. And again, we'll talk about what beginning construction means in this context. It has a very specific meaning. If you can begin construction by the end of this year, you have until the end of 2029 to finish up and start operating the plant. You also will be able to avoid some of the worst of the foreign entity of concern rules. And this is where we start to get into some of the differences here. Everyone who uses the new version of the ITC is going to be subject to foreign entity of concern rules to a degree. So the first sort of step is thinking about who owns the project. If the project is owned by just, a mom and pop business here in the United States, both are U.S. citizens, both green card holders even, there's no real problem. Where we start to get into more nuanced situations is where we have something like, maybe a multinational business that owns a project or that owns a piece of a project. Then we have to start thinking about, well, who ultimately owns that project? And do we have too much ownership of the project or debt issued by the project owner by one of those covered nations types of people? So a Chinese citizen, a Chinese corporation, an Iranian corporation, Russian, something like that. Now, we can still figure things out, particularly when it comes to just basic equity ownership. And we are doing that right now. We're not only figuring things out, we're also restructuring some companies, as you can imagine. But the rules are annoying, and they will apply beginning next year. The thornier one is the one that you avoid if you can begin construction by the end of this year. That thornier one is called material assistance. What they're really talking about, though, is supply chain. They're talking about supply chain and different contracts that create some kind of control over the project, over the solar project. That one is really thorny because if you've ever had a conversation with one of your supply chain members and you said, hey, tell me all about how you're owned, all the way up to the ultimate shareholder, they probably are just going to look at you funny or they're going to hang up the phone, right? And so that's why those material assistance rules are more difficult, okay? Now, all is not lost if you can't begin construction this year. If you can still begin construction during the next half of next year, the first half of next year, by July 3rd of next year, you can still have time to finish that solar plant. You'll still have 4 years until the end of 2030. But you will have to deal with all of the foreign entity of concern rules. Again, it's not game over, not by a long shot. It's just more complicated. And, when things get more complicated, they tend to get more expensive and annoying. But that said, it is still possible to get a solar plant built. The real problems start after July 3rd. If you begin construction on 4th of July, which is going to be our 250th anniversary next year, then you have to finish your solar plant by the end of 27 or you don't get any credits at all. They're just gone at that point. And so that's really the hard period that's going to begin. Now, on small solar, can you still get the plant built? Yeah, maybe. But 18 months to fully develop a solar plant is not much. Particularly when you start to consider things like permitting and whatnot. So that can be very difficult at a certain point. So I've been promising to explain what beginning of construction means. So here again, I don't want to get into thorny details. What you need to keep in mind today in terms of what beginning of construction means, it's basically 3 different things. Either you're spending a specific amount of money, 5% on the project, which is a valid option right now for projects of under 1.5 megawatts, so smaller solar. Or better yet, you're doing that and you're beginning either on-site or off-site physical work. So on-site and off-site physical work are something is happening, something is being built, right? It's going to be used in this project. So for example, on-site might be that you're installing some portion of a carport system for a carport solar plant, or perhaps you're pouring concrete foundations for a battery pad or something along those lines. What you're really focused on there is some kind of work at the site where the plant will be located. And it's work that you can do now, and it's not going to degrade over time before you get around to actually building the rest of the plant. Some people can't do that either because they don't have site control or they don't have the right permits just yet. And so then we start looking at off-site significant physical work. Off-site significant physical work is basically it's manufacturing, but it's manufacturing of certain things that will go into that plant. So again, thinking about a carport system, it can be making some portion of the carport supports. It can be starting work on certain parts of a transformer that's going to be incorporated into the plant. Although that's not something we see very often with small solar, in theory, it's possible. It could mean other kinds of techniques that are available. For example, some of the electrical system might work. Now, you'll notice that I'm not saying a whole lot of options here. It's not that we don't have options, it's just that we have to be careful what the requirements are for significant physical work. And the key thing is that whatever you're having made is not held in inventory. That's the key thing. That's why you're thinking about things that are a little bit more custom, like carport supports, for example. And so I said a minute ago that even better, you're doing 5% and you're doing some kind of significant physical work. That's because we have some regulatory uncertainty right now. That regulatory uncertainty basically points in the direction of doing significant physical work of some sort. Because once you start making something for a solar plant, you have a much better argument that you really started creating that solar plant and you're going to follow through. That said, significant physical work doesn't always involve putting a whole lot of money on the line. That's a good thing, obviously, from a commercial perspective. But when you get into an audit, you want to be able to defend your position as well as you possibly can. And in those kinds of situations, if you can say, look, I made this thing, and also I spent this amount of money, that can be somewhat helpful. So with that, of course, we're more than happy to take questions on these requirements. I would suggest that that we start thinking about some of the other content that Tom has here first, and we can always come back to some questions.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Elizabeth, for those awesome insights. That's a great breakdown. And yeah, we'll get into kind of what we have on the solution side and how we can help you take action. So, whether you're just starting your clean energy journey or you're looking to optimize an existing project, we've got tools and strategies designed to help you stay compliant, unlock savings, and position your business for long-term success. So let's take a look at how we can support you here. So we can do rooftop, carport, or ground-mounted solutions. Our model at NorthStar is developing, owning, and operating these projects for our customers and helping them achieve sustainable solutions as a long-term partner. A lot of customers like this model since they can focus their capital on their core business, and solar becomes then more of an operating versus a capital expense for them, since they don't have to deploy any capital outlay until the projects are up and producing. And in addition, we also have a tranche of first solar modules that will be unaffected by fiat concerns that are coming in December, as Elizabeth mentioned, to help support upcoming projects as well. And so, yeah, again, before we dive into questions here, I'd love to get a quick sense of interest. If you think maybe a one-on-one conversation to explore solutions could be helpful, go ahead and take a moment to respond to this poll that's going to be coming up on the screen now. It'll only take a few seconds, and it'll help us follow up with you more effectively. And then thank you to everyone that responded to the poll. Really appreciate the interest. If you'd indicate you'd like a one-on-one or more information, be in touch soon to coordinate that. Now let's open it up to questions for the next 10 minutes. Feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll get them in order. Are there any proposed extensions or renewals for these tax credits in the bill? Elizabeth, maybe do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so right now there aren't. The bill that was passed, OBBBA or OBBBA, depending on who you ask, really truncated a lot of those timelines. Historically, we've seen extensions and renewals, okay? They're pretty frequent, but right now we're on the year of this particular administration's term. And so I'm not optimistic that we'll see any renewals or extensions until there's the next presidential administration, and maybe not even then. And then for those of you still who are sort of new to the game, right? On the left on the screen, Tom's got a carport system, which is one of the things that I referred to earlier. One of the beginning of construction strategies for carport systems, right, is those supports, those beams that you see supporting the panels at the top. Those are all customized. They're not really held in inventory. They're a little bit different depending on which site you're at. Rooftop systems over on the right can be done for beginning of construction, but generally speaking, we're looking at on-site solutions for those because a lot of the equipment that's in an on-site system, or excuse me, in a rooftop system is fairly routine, fairly inventoried. The middle picture, of course, is a ground mount system. Ground mount systems have a fair bit of potential, frankly, for beginning of construction, both on-site and off-site. We do have tools at our disposal and techniques that have been used relatively frequently. Some of them are a little supply chain constrained at the moment, but generally speaking, we can pull something off for on-site, or excuse me, for ground mount on-site. I think one of the nice things too about these commercial and industrial sites, the smaller solar sites that are usually co-located with a corporation or something like that, is that often site control is already available, which makes it a little easier to find a solution.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. How are you seeing companies deal with the foreign entity of concern rule concerns?
Yeah, so foreign entity of concern is definitely weighing on people's minds. There's sort of a timeline progression in the industry about this. We have different credits for different things. The credits that are getting the most attention for foreign entity of concern right now have to do with manufacturing. And that's relevant here because the manufacturing tax credits that are available essentially serve to try to reduce the cost further for solar and batteries and some other stuff, inverters that go with solar plants. And because those credits are first in line for the foreign entity of concern restrictions, we're seeing a lot of activity there where some companies are just restructuring, right, because they can, or because that option is available to them. Restructuring reduces the issue, right? And so they can still qualify for the tax credit. So their equipment is still cost competitive, right, when it's made in the United States. We are also seeing some people weigh their options pretty carefully. I have heard people talk about leaving the US market, relocating operations offshore. Now, usually they don't. If they already qualify for that credit, it's pretty valuable. So usually they're not going offshore, but we are seeing some other supply chain participants think ahead to the next round. Then the next round of foreign entity of concern issues will impact the solar credits, okay? And it's a little bit farther off just because of how supply chain works in this industry, but we are already seeing some supply chain members basically say, okay, well, is the US market worth it to me? You know, they may be manufacturing anywhere in the world. They might be manufacturing in Thailand or Vietnam or India, but they're actually owned by Chinese. And they would have to completely restructure or sell off the business or take on a huge investment, something like that. Maybe the US market's worth it to them and maybe it's not. And so I think in those areas, things that don't qualify for the 45X credit, we are starting to see some wheels turn where folks are thinking ahead. Maybe they'll continue, And some of them, I suspect some of them will actually leave the US market. Hopefully not so many, because obviously they'll have knock-on effects for cost of installing projects, which we definitely don't want. I think there's another question in the Q&A right now that sort of impacts this, which is, can on-site or behind-the-meter solar system save me money versus my utility bill, right? I think the point there is really about your utility costs, but you also have to think about the capital expenditure of the system and how quickly you'll recover that. Tom, I'll kick that back to you because you guys are really the ones to talk about that.
Yeah, appreciate that, Elizabeth. Yeah, so, it depends on the location within the United States, as well as utility costs and the scale of it generally. But if we can get there on those items, we've seen it pencil really in most areas, kind of to where you're kind of saving money from day one, and you're fully behind the meter. You're still owning the environmental attributes from the system, but the system the production from the system that you're paying for is at a lesser rate than what you're paying the utility for that fixed portion of the bill. And that's fixed for 20, 25 years. The panels are warranted for 30 years, so a lot of good potential there as an energy hedge.
Yeah, definitely.
I see some more questions rolling in, so keep them coming, guys. Appreciate that. Are only solar and wind clean energy solutions impacted by the expiration of these tax credits, and does this also include battery systems?
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So all the deadlines that we had, and maybe you can flip back to that slide, all of those deadlines are for solar and wind, okay? Now, batteries factor in here. Batteries still qualify for quite a while. You do have to begin construction by the end of, I think it's 2030, but that's, a few years out. But the material assistance and other foreign entity of concern rules are currently applicable to battery systems. So if you don't qualify for the old ITC because you began construction by the end of last year, you will be subject to these foreign entity of concern rules, both the ownership as well as the debt ownership and also the supply chain issues. What does that mean for batteries? Well, batteries are hard, frankly, when it comes to the foreign entity of concern rules. A lot of the global supply chain in batteries is controlled by China. We do have significant mining operations there. That's started to change in the last 3 years. It's more and more possible to buy batteries that don't have a significant nexus with China. And so we are seeing that progress. Tesla, for example, is a good example. Their Powerwall products and Megapack products are a little bit farther away from China than some of the other products in the market. And we are seeing some batteries be built here in the United States with sort of minimal Chinese impact. But batteries will be subject to these rules. And so it is important, I think, to start construction on batteries this year too, so that you can avoid those material assistance rules, because the material assistance rules are the ones that are going to be the most problematic. So if it's possible to do that, what you're going to be looking at is that middle light green line where you begin construction by the 31st, and you're going to finish up by the end of the 29th of 2029. Beginning construction for battery systems is somewhat similar as for solar. If you have site control, I would strongly suggest going out there and pouring some concrete pads for the batteries or other aspects of the plant. Don't try to just go, put some bolts in the ground in an existing parking lot. That's not going to do the trick. Think about where this specific battery is going to go, if you have that idea, and go pour a pad for that. Offsite physical work for batteries, it's possible, but it can be a little difficult. What we're usually looking at is not the battery itself. We're looking at something else in the plant. You start to run into supply chain constraints fairly quickly. But again, it's possible. I've done it. And there are options that you can explore depending on supply chain pressures. After that, though, after the end of this year, you're going to need to really be prepared to deal with the material assistance rules. And I suspect there's going to be a bit of a stall in the market for certain battery components. either because those that are compliant with material assistance have had a run on them in the market, right? And their desks are pretty full, right? Or because it's just going to take a minute for some of the other manufacturers to catch up. Now, we are seeing some restructurings in the market for that. We are seeing some plants move to different countries, Turkey, for example. One of the nice things about this happening now is that we can also deal with tariffs at the same time. And so I'm optimistic that the battery market will be fine. But I do think that there's going to be a bit of a pause where there's going to be some supply chain constraints.
Yeah, well said, Elizabeth. Appreciate that insight.
Mm-hmm.
Next question I'm seeing here is, what is the typical time frame to construct a project from beginning to end and in general? I can take that one. Typically, it's on the shorter end, depending on the size and scale. It's definitely size, scale, type of system dependent. But on the shorter end, we could see it at around a year. But towards the larger scale with interconnection queues and permitting timelines, that's generally the long lead time items. Generally, when you get to the construction part, it's the fast part, but it's just getting there on those larger projects. We could see it, closer to the year and 6 months, 2 years, depending on the scale for some of these on-site behind-the-meter solutions.
It's going to be interesting to hear what you have to say too. The smaller the project, the quicker it usually goes, particularly when you can do behind the meter. But it does take time. In my practice, those timelines are pretty consistent. So it's not just NorthStar.
Are there any zero money down options for on-site solar systems where we only pay a monthly charge once the system is up and running? Yeah, I mean, that's pretty congruent with what we offer at NorthStar, where we're kind of in that power purchase agreement or lease or service agreement model, depending on the state we're in, where we're kind of coming in as the financer, putting it on our balance sheet, and really sticking it out as the owner operator once it's up and running to build the system, engineer it, procure all the material, and that's all on NorthStar's balance sheet. And then the end customer would benefit because they're not paying anything until the system's up and producing, and then you're only just paying the monthly fee for the power, and hopefully that monthly fee is cheaper than what you're paying your current utility. And we're seeing that in some areas of the country.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. If there's no more questions, appreciate all the engagement. As a reminder, for those of you that express interest in a one-on-one, we'll be reaching out shortly to schedule some time. Or if you'd like more information, we can send you some additional follow-up. Appreciate everyone joining today. Hope you found this valuable. Look forward to continuing the conversation, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks,
Okay.
Elizabeth, too.
Thank you, Tom. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.